Hi there. I'm going to talk about Kant and the sublime, which is the second part of your reading that I signed in Kant's third critique. The sublime is a very curious idea that Kant talks about. It's also a very famous passage of Kant's philosophy, um, and it has exerted significant influence in philosophy of beauty still today. In fact, in the 20th century, there were some contemporary philosophers who took up the idea of the sublime again and applied it to contemporary art in ways that beyond Kant could have imagined. Which is interesting because when you should have noticed from the reading that when Kant talks about the sublime, his examples are largely from nature. So why does he talk about the sublime? Why does he feel compelled? Well, it is a different type of aesthetic experience. That's the short of it. The experience of beauty is one kind of aesthetic experience, and the sublime is another one. And it is quite different. I don't know that we could say it's the opposite, but it is very, very different. And it is morally momentous. It is morally significant. So I want you to think about, how the sublime and the beautiful are similar and how they are different. As to their difference, he does indicate a couple things. He says that the sublime is formless, it is boundless, which is a distinction from beauty because, as we saw in the section on beauty, that Kant believes that the form of, say, an art object is constitutive of or determinative of the beauty of an object, right? Recall his discussion of charm or what is superfluous or unimportant, even a hindrance to the beauty of an artwork. He says that amounts to color or frills or embellishments, whatever obscures the form of an object, because the form itself is what grounds and determines its beauty. So it's interesting that he says that the sublime is formless, boundless. That's referring also to boundaries, okay? He says also that the sublime violates purpose. That's your translation, which again is interesting to think in contrast to the beautiful, which he says has purposiveness without purpose, or the beautiful betrays design, and yet or what's not indicated or made clear in the beautiful is what that design is for. A beautiful rose betrays design, but not for any particular function, or certainly not for a function that we can imagine or fully grasp or fathom. That's how Kant saw it. I was saying in our last conversation, however, that Kant wrote this before much biology before biologists had started to analyze the various parts of the rose, for example, to understand what those parts are, what those parts do. But so the functionality of any given part of a design was not clear. But besides that, the point remains that the beautiful is something that transcends our own functionality and our own purpose. That's the pure aesthetic, by the way. So he says the sublime violates purpose. And he also says then that the sublime has to do with that which is, quote, absolutely great. In your translation, that's on page 64. This leads him to say that no object of the senses can be called sublime. It eludes sensing. Okay, so this is strange. Aesthesis in Greek means what pertains to the senses. The beautiful is something we sense. The sublime is also going to be something we sense, but it is going to be sensing something that eludes the senses. What does that mean? It eludes our grasp in a way. It eludes how our senses normally operate. How our senses normally operate is that they work in tandem with conceptualization, and they allow me to form a concept of what I am feeling or seeing or smelling. With the sublime, that relationship is severed. Consider the examples he gives. He gives to express what, to illustrate the sublime. He talks about the pyramids. He talks about St. Peter's in Rome. Now, I will point out that these are human artifice. These are human construction. What is funny about the pyramids, and by the way, at his time, of course, the pyramids would have been, and St. Peter's, these would have been the largest structures that he would have known of. So they pale in comparison, of course, to say the skyscrapers in Manhattan. That might be an interesting contemporary analog. And besides the fact that here's something a little bit funny, a personal note about Kant, he never left his home city. So he feels confident to talk with these examples, but he's reading the travel guides of those who have visited them. He's not speaking from his own experience. Pyramids. Notice the comment about the pyramids where he says that the sublime, the experience of the sublime is determined upon how you portray, how you see the pyramids. In other words, you can't see them from too far back or too close. If you see them too close, you're facing a wall, and that's not very impressive. Too far back, they look puny. You have to see them just right. Maybe you see the outlines of those massive stones. I have actually seen the pyramids, and one of the things that has really confused or perplexed researchers and archaeologists is how those gigantic stones were raised into place without archaeologists have tried to figure out again Egyptian engineering, but without knowing that, it is quite miraculous to see these stones in place. And so the experience of the stones, if you see the pyramids in just the right way, you are overwhelmed, I guess, is the experience. At St. Peter's in Rome, which is where the Pope has his chair, a similarly massive structure, he speaks of an inadequacy of the imagination. What does that mean? Well, I explained in our last discussion that for Kant, the imagination means something specific. It means forming an image that then can be understood and transferred or translated into concepts so that you know what you're seeing. So when you see something overwhelming in St. Peter's, you're seeing a structure that is bigger than you can put words to, than you can understand. He does say, however, that there's a problem with these. He says they don't offer insight into pure aesthetical judgment, probably because we can understand how they were made by human artifice. To receive pure aesthetical judgment of the sublime, he says, we have to look to rude nature. That's a quote on page 68. He gives examples of the monster. He talks about the monstrous and the colossal, probably like a tornado that bears down upon you. A few years ago, there was a tornado that hit a city in Oklahoma, and it was a mile wide. Seeing that would be an experience of the sublime. Seeing a hurricane at a certain vantage point, being immersed in a storm. These are examples of the sublime. These are pure examples of aesthetic judgment of the sublime. And he says there is a kind of satisfaction that comes with the sublime. That's what's also curious here. There's a kind of pleasure. We discussed that briefly when it comes to beauty. What is the pleasure of seeing the sublime? Well, I misspoke a second ago. You may not be immersed in the storm, because then you have no time for contemplation. You're trying to save your life. There is a degree of safety here, that you're able to see this awe-inspiring object that transcends your senses. You're able to see it from a distance. He talks about this on page 72. He acknowledged that there is a kind of violence here, there is a kind of pain here, but it is a pleasant pain. He describes it in terms of like an affirmation of your own rationality, of human rationality, right? That there is a wonder of rationality, of there's the wonder of human reason in this universe with cruel forces and destructive forces. Morally, he talks about how it, when you see a disaster like that from a distance, when you see a tornado from a distance and then the damage it wreaks, it will make you value your own life, or may make you reevaluate what is important to you. And it will hopefully minimize certain concerns that once consumed you, if you understand what I'm saying. He distinguishes between the mathematically sublime and the dynamically sublime. Mathematically has to do with size, dynamic has to do with force. I think that you can understand where that plays out in the examples I've been giving so far. But he does stipulate here on page 74 that, the sublime is experienced when we see a natural event that has power, immense power, but no specific dominion over us. So it's not fear, but it's awe. Or as he puts on 74, we fear it without being afraid of it. So there, you make of that what you will. I think that sounds like awe. He gives some examples again on page 75. I will let you take a look at those. And there is an interesting discussion a few pages later where he talks about, prerequisites for experiencing the sublime. It does seem to be perspectively influenced or determined. I was trying to explain that in the example of the pyramid. It will not be sublime depending on where you see it. But it turns out that he thinks there is also a kind of personal preparation for experiencing the sublime. Not everyone is going to have a sublime experience when they see a pyramid or a storm or an earthquake, for example. And he tells us on page 778, somewhere around here, he says that, what is needed before people judge the sublime? He says it's culture. What should we make of that? I think that involves a certain degree of education and understanding and appreciation, because it's going to be more than just fear. Fear involves ignorance. And yet he described the experience of the sublime as appreciating something incredibly powerful and massive without fearing for your life. He gives a very memorable example here on page 78, I believe, or somewhere around here, of someone who lives in the Alps. For him, the gigantic peaks are a source of terror and fear. For the cultured person, because they have no appreciation for what else they can be gained from them. Whereas the cultured person, the educated person, is someone who can have an experience of the sublime when beholding these Alps, these peaks. So interesting discussion there. Maybe it sounds a little bit elitist. Make of it what you will. Let me move on and talk about genius. The other significant passage or topic, I should say, in your reading this module is on genius. What does he mean by genius? Well, first of all, genius has, maybe I should pause for a second and just talk about, because I'm going to talk about the etymology of genius, where this idea comes from. So I should have said something about the etymology of the sublime, or the history of the sublime. It is a very curious idea that has some predecessors. It has come up a few times prior to Kant, most notably in the writings of an English philosopher by the name of Edmund Burke, where he spoke of the same thing, but in a slightly different way. I'm not going to get into details because I don't want to cause any confusion. It is not, when he talks about sublime, it is not related to the subliminal. And it is certainly not to be understood in relation to how we say something is sublime, right? I don't know how we're inclined to use that word today. When something is delicious or amazingly good, we call it sublime. That is not at all how Kant meant it. He has a very specific technical meaning for it. When it comes to genius, genius is a Latin word. The Romans spoke of ingenium. That's how they would have pronounced it. Ingenium. What is your ingenium? Your ingenium is, the Romans understood, an attendant spirit present from one's birth, an innate ability or inclination. Genius was something that one had. Nowadays, genius is, a person is a genius. Who is a genius? Well, in America, we talk about entrepreneurs as being geniuses, like Steve Jobs, Bill Gates. Albert Einstein is a genius. That is precisely not what Kant is talking about here. He's not talking about people who are geniuses, by the way. He's going to talk about people who have genius, and who in particular has genius in this context of this discussion. It is people who create beautiful art. Artists have genius, not scientists, okay? This would have been an alien notion for Kant. This is not to say that, well, let me just pause there and move on. I was going to say something I'm not sure I can say just yet about the relationship of science and art. But he's referring to artists. Artists have genius. Genius describes the nature of their creation. And what does that, or the nature of their creative spirit, and what does that, the nature of their creativity, what does the Latin etymology suggest? It suggests that this creative spirit is going to be something almost divine, otherworldly, that the artist is not the author of, or does not have control over. And he tells us immediately right at the beginning, in 112, he says, beautiful art cannot itself devise the rule according to which it can bring about its product. Beautiful art cannot devise the rule according to which it can bring about its product. What that means is that there's no rule book for beautiful art, which you can then follow and create it yourself. That's why he says beautiful art is only possible as a product of genius. He goes on to describe the work of genius with a couple points. He said it is original. It's a talent for producing that for which no definite rule can be given. That's what we said a second ago. There's no rule book. Works of genius, beautiful art, which are works of genius, are original. There's no rule book. He says it is also exemplary. The work of genius is exemplary. They must serve. So in other words, there is no standard or rule by which you can then follow and then make beautiful art. You must look to works of art and they serve as examples of beauty, which then should inspire the artist. That's the best that they can do in terms of teaching, if you will. And the genius cannot communicate how he or she does what they do, right? They do not know how they come up with their ideas. Genius is incommunicable. The creative spirit behind a work of art is utterly, or is ultimately incommunicable. Genius, all of this goes, conspires to make the point that genius cannot be taught. It is not teachable. This always leads to an interesting discussion with, I've indicated this earlier, that I teach in an art school. So this becomes a very uncomfortable conversation at my art college when the students are paying very high tuition. We get to talk about how genius cannot be taught. So what the heck are they doing? What are they learning? Well, this is something you can think about further on your own. I hope to hear more discussion in the comments in your conversations with each other. And this is a very rich topic for your own research papers. But my art students, they tend to agree that there is something ultimately incommunicable about what distinguishes remarkable works of art. There's something that they cannot exactly get across or convey or articulate. What can be taught? Well, skills, for example. Skills can be taught. Pairings of color, for example. The use of color. The use of materials. Those are the kinds of things that can be taught. Now I'm glad I paused there when I was talking about science, because he does talk towards the end here about science and about how art compares to science when it comes to genius. And he tells us on page 114, he says that art stands still at a certain point. Science does not. What does that mean? Science has progress. Science knows progress. Scientists, they can communicate what they're doing. They can pass it on to other generations. They can provide a model for what they do that can be transmitted, and then scientists, their work can build on one another. That is not the case with art, Kant argues, which is interesting because artists will often say that they are responding to or speaking to the work of another artist or another tradition, but it is certainly the case that they are not building on the work of art, those previous artists. Or let me put it this way, it is very controversial to talk about progress in art. Kant does not believe there's such thing as progress when it comes to art. That does not necessarily mean, that's not necessarily a pejorative statement. That's not necessarily a negative assessment. Now, Hegel, we'll see soon, he does talk about progress when it comes to art, but that leads to some very surprising conclusions, even uncomfortable conclusions. Last point here, when he talks about genius, he says that, when we talk about beauty, we talked about taste, the experience of seeing the beautiful. But then there is the genius who creates the beautiful. And what about the interworking, is that a word? Cooperation, I should say, interdependence of taste and genius. What about that relationship? Well, taste pertains to judging beautiful art, while genius pertains to producing it. And he says that in most artists, it seems that both are at play. So the artist is someone who exercises both. The artist has taste and genius. But then he raises a really weird question, which is, there are cases where you can have genius without taste and taste without genius. I've often asked my art students what that would look like. I'm unsure at the moment what that would look like. It sounds strange. Maybe certain types of art where beauty is not the operative standard. Maybe that's an example of genius without taste. But he does ask the question, which is preferable? Genius without taste or taste without genius? Beautiful art is a combination of taste and genius, but if they are ever in conflict, Kant says, and one must be sacrificed, he says it is genius. Genius must be sacrificed. And his reasoning seems to be that he is afraid genius would run wild in its freedom and become anarchic. Taste is a more reliable, less dangerous guide for the artist. So there you have it. This is a really fascinating part of Kant's third critique, and I hope it gave you a lot of food for thought. And I look forward to hearing your questions. I imagine you will have some or many. Please do reach out to me, and we will take them up. Take care. Bye.